It's time for another Boortzcast.
Neal Boortz, everybody, and welcome to another Boortzcast. A little more formal introduction this time because I'm going to make this Boortzcast available to the FairTax people so that they can post it on YouTube. People can get it for nothing. But that's not going to come without a little commercial. For me, I'm a retired old fart, but for 43 years, I did talk radio. For the last, about 20 years, I was syndicated nationwide, about 260 radio stations. I guess that put me about number 4 or 5 on the total number of talk radio listeners out there. Member of the United States Radio, the U.S. Hall of Fame, the Radio Hall of Fame in Chicago. But in the subject at hand, taxes, Georgia Congressman John Linder and I wrote a book called The FairTax Book, Saying Goodbye to the Income Tax and the IRS. Now, that was 22 years ago, and a lot of people listening to this probably never heard of the FairTax, never heard of the FairTax book. A lot of you have, and I don't want this to get repetitive and boring, but I'm going to give you some background. Congressman John Linder was a friend of mine. He knew that on my radio show for many, many years, I had been promoting the idea of replacing the income tax with a national retail sales tax and getting rid of the IRS. Well, John Linder came to me to talk about a bill that he had introduced into the Congress of the United States called the FairTax Bill. I looked at the legislation and I absolutely loved it. And I got behind it full force on my little radio show. So one night, Congressman Linder and his wife having dinner with me and my queen, and we're talking about his fair tax legislation. His wife says, "Look, why don't you two just write a book about this so we don't have to sit around and talk about it every time we get together?" And Linder looked at me and he said, "Let's do it." And we did. The FairTax book was born. Now, here's the shocker. The FairTax book was released on August the 2nd of 2005. On the next New York Times bestseller list, after the book's released, it was number one New York Times bestseller. Not in any specific little category like number one in business or number one tax book or number one thriller. It was the number one nonfiction book, period. I started on a book tour around the country at these bookstores, Barnes & Nobles, Borders. I think they existed at that time. The crowd there for a book and to get it signed would exceed the capacity of the building. We had fire marshals, police officers trying to keep the crowds contained. We had a rally. Well, we had a couple of rallies. We had a rally on the streets of downtown Orlando, Florida one time. Thousands of people there. I frankly forget how many thousands of people crowded those streets, but I'm looking at it from a hotel room before I went down there and talked. It was huge. Gwinnett County, Georgia, the Gwinnett County Convention Center, a rally there for the FairTax. I believe that crowd was 15,000 people. Congressmen who were sponsors of the FairTax bill in Congress, and it's still there, by the way, but congressmen who were sponsors would invite me into their home districts to go to one of their town hall meetings and talk about the FairTax, and they would have to get a new venue that would hold thousands of people. That's how people, not how they felt about me. It's how they felt about the FairTax. And the FairTax started getting a lot of attention from the media, from people in Washington. I was called to testify before a Senate subcommittee one time about the FairTax. But, okay, enough about the FairTax book. Oh, by the way, We also wrote a second book, FairTax, The Truth, Answering the Critics, because the FairTax frightened people people in power, people in Washington. It frightened them so badly, they started coming out with the most inane, lame, absurd objections to the FairTax. They were so easily refuted that John Linder and I wrote a second book, along with the help of Rob Woodall, who ran for and won John Linder's seat after he retired. Okay, I'm going to give you a brief background on this, and I'm operating with no notes. I saw this tax plan come out last night. I said, okay, I'm going to throw a Boortzcast out there in the morning. I'm not going to make it too long. That'll come later as we argue this so-called tax reform plan from the Republicans and Trump's mind, which this tax reform plan, it's, to me, worthless. It'll help a little bit, but it wouldn't do what the FairTax would do. 3 very wealthy Houston businessmen. You can get details, names, all of that by just ordering the FairTax book. You can get it from Amazon.com right now in just a couple of days for $4. But these 3 very wealthy Houston businessmen, one of them the current owner of the Houston Texans NFL team, they had this little sideline that they would engage in. Hobby, call it what you will, but they would like to tackle impossible problems and come up with possible, probable solutions. The story is that one of these businessmen in one of their meetings or social get-togethers was complaining about all of the time they spent in corporate business meetings talking about tax matters. How every time any of his businesses wanted to go out and try something, do something new, they had to spend just an immense amount of time discussing the tax implementations of their business plans. Tax considerations, always the number one topic. So one of these guys, not sure which one, said to the other, well, why don't we quit complaining about it and do something about it? Well, what do you mean? Let's propose a complete revision of the federal tax code. Let's put some research behind it, okay? Not just ideas that pop up at the spur of the moment. Let's put some research behind this. Let's come up with a good, viable plan to reform the tax code and then put some money behind promoting it. So they spent $22 million. $22 million on tax consultants, on economists, on researchers, on focus groups, talking to the American people, $22 million. Now, these 3 highly successful and high tax-paying businessmen, Leo Lindbeck Jr., Jack Trotter, and Bob McNeal, the owner of the Houston Texans, they pledged that whatever plan their group of researchers, economists, scientists, whatever they came up with, these 3 guys were going to get behind it and they were going to promote it. And they thought that certainly, almost certainly, the plan that would be presented to them, the plan developed with their money, was going to be some sort of a flat tax. Well, they were wrong. It wasn't a flat tax. It was a national retail sales tax. And why was it called the FairTax? Because during one of the focus groups held by these researchers, toward the end of their work, they presented this tax plan to a focus group, and somebody in that focus group said, well, that is a fair tax.